Good evening, everyone. It's great to see such a nice turnout tonight. I'm James Herbert, the president of the University of New England, and I want to thank everyone, our students, community members, faculty, trustees, friends of the university, lots of people. I want to thank you all for being here for this special event, part of the UNE President's Forum, as we will consider, is Trump a strongman president, and can our democracy endure? This is the 10th event in this series, and I think it's going to be one of the most interesting ones yet, so I'm really looking forward to it. American democracy, once the envy of the free world, seems suddenly vulnerable. For better or for worse, with the Trump administration disregarding long-held norms and exerting unprecedented influence on practically every institution in our society, from the judiciary to the Federal Reserve, the media to the public health establishment, museums to grade school curricula, and certainly, not least, higher education, many people have wondered if this is what it looks like to be sliding into autocracy. President Trump has not run away from this characterization. In fact, he's embraced it, openly musing that the American people might just prefer a dictator rather than a president. And he's been selling hats for some time that say Trump 2028, even though he's constitutionally ineligible to run for a third term. Meanwhile, the integrity of the 2026 midterm elections has already been thrown into question. Amid a pressure campaign from President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, Republican-led states are redrawing their congressional districts and effectively gaining extra seats before a single vote is cast. Some Democratic-led states are scrambling to follow suit. At the same time, Trump is saying that absentee and mail-in ballots submitted in the next cycle should not be counted, and in states where they are counted, the election results should be considered invalid. All of this is to say that our American democracy is in a state of flux right now. The rules of the game seem to be changing or even disappearing before our very eyes. And the level of polarization in our government has never been higher. Elected officials on both sides of the aisle spare no punches in describing members of the opposing party as anti-American, dangerous, or even evil. What was once a battle of ideas between congenial statesmen and stateswomen has devolved into a battle of warring personalities, screaming at one another across the divide. One need only witness the legal rancor over National Guard deployments in American cities, or the entrenched perspectives leading to the current shutdown of the federal government, to appreciate the level of division in our body politic. All of this rancor has trickled down into our own lives, fueling anxiety and bitterness within individuals, families, and communities. We increasingly see those with different views as not merely incorrect, but as stupid or even malevolent. We react by either lashing out or by retreating into self-censorship. And the divisions that rack society only grow deeper. The culmination of this division is violence. We have witnessed an alarming uptick in political violence over the past year. We were all shocked when, less than a month ago, conservative activist Charlie Kirk was assassinated while engaging in a debate with students at Utah Valley University. Kirk's death comes on the heels of the assassination of a Minnesota state lawmaker and her husband in June. And then incendiary devices thrown into a crowd during a peaceful rally in Boulder, Colorado, also in June, a fire set at the home of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro while he and his family slept inside in April, and of course, the shooting of President Trump at a campaign rally last July. In short, we are losing the art of civil discourse with those who think differently from us, with potentially devastating consequences for our society. At the University of New England, we're committed to doing our part to combat this trend. We proactively foster discourse on difficult topics from a perspective of intellectual humility, curiosity, and civility. We do this through a variety of programs that together comprise our Marketplace of Ideas initiative. And one of these programs is this President's Forum. Each forum consists of a moderated discussion that allows us to take a deep dive into an important, timely topic from different angles. Along the way, we model how to engage in productive discourse. Tonight's conversation draws our attention to the state of our American democracy. Hopefully, by the end of the evening, we will better understand what's at stake for America on a deeper level, and will have been introduced to some new ways of thinking and talking about the political upheaval through which we're all living. Our first guest, William G. Howell, comes to us from Johns Hopkins University, where he serves as the Dean of the School of Government and Policy. He has co-authored a thought-provoking book titled Trajectory of Power, The Rise of the Strongman Presidency. And I'll stop short of saying too much more about the book, so William can explain its thesis in his own words shortly. And by the way, we do have copies of the book for sale right over in the corner here. So if you're interested, please pick up a copy. Joining him in conversation will be our other distinguished guest, Andrew Rudalevige. I'm sorry, Andrew. Andy, I tried. Rudalevige. Sorry. Should have got that better. Rudalevige, who serves as the Thomas Brackett Reed Professor of Government at Bowdoin College right here in Maine. Andrew has written several books of his own on the modern presidency and is widely regarded as one of the foremost experts on the U.S. government's executive branch. I'd like to extend my sincere appreciation to both William and Andrew for bringing their insights and expertise to our UNE community tonight. So please join me in giving them a warm nor'easter welcome. And serving as the moderator of tonight's discussion will be an eminent political scientist in her own right, former Dean of UNE's College of Arts and Sciences, Jeanne A.K, who now serves as CEO of Hay University and holds the title of UNE Dean Emerita. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hay back to campus. In addition to expressing my heartfelt appreciation to these individuals, I'd also like to thank the many UNE students, faculty, and professional staff in attendance, as well as members of our wider community. And I'd also like to offer a special welcome to many distinguished guests with us this evening, including a number of members of our UNE Board of Trustees and some former trustees as well. And thank you all for joining us and for all that you do for the university. I'm also grateful to the many people at UNE, including members of my leadership team and the offices of communications, conference services, facilities, all of whom helped make this event possible. And finally, I'd like to thank some very special people who've committed to supporting the President's Forum, including my friends Ford and Karen Reike and Tim and Marnie Black. And if anyone else, by the way, would like to join the Blacks and the Reikes in supporting this program or our larger Marketplace of Ideas initiatives, you know where to find me. As for the format of tonight's event, we'll begin with a few words from our moderator, and then William will briefly lay out the thesis of his new book, followed by initial commentary from Andrew. We'll then move on to the moderated conversation, and finally, we'll engage with you, our audience, for a question and answer period with our panelists. And I remind you that there should be no interrupting of the speakers until that time with the Q&A period. And when we do get to the Q&A, the expectation is that your questions will remain on topic and, of course, be respectful. Given the horrific tragedy at Utah Valley University, the kind of dialogue we will engage in this evening has never been more critical. So now let's begin. Thank you. Jeanne?
Thank you so much, President Herbert. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Let me begin by saying to the many people in the back, we do have a number of seats here up front, and best seats in the house. So please make yourselves comfortable because there is room. And again, thank you, James, and thank you so much to both William and Andy. They've given me permission to call them William and Andy. And I think let's just dive right in. And I'm going to ask William to begin by talking to us about the thesis of the book that we all have up here, Trajectory of Power, a very good and very accessible read. Thank you very much for that, and speaks to the question tonight. So thank you.
Great. Jeanne, thank you for moderating our conversation, to the President for bringing us together, to all of you for joining in conversation. I was allotted 5 minutes. The book is, it's got a lot in it. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of what we're trying to do in this book. This is a book that I wrote with my doctoral dissertation advisor, Terry Moe. We've written 3 books together. This is the 3rd one. And it's trying to make sense of what's going on with the American presidency. I have, as has Andy, spent our entire professional lives thinking about executive power and trying to make sense of the contours of it, the limits of it, the origins of it, how executive power works in a democracy. And Terry and I finished this book just before the last election. And so this is not a book that comments on the last 9 months and 16 days, if you're counting. And a lot has happened in those 9 months and 16 days. And so I am not going to linger on the 9 months and 16 days and give you a readout. You have been paying attention to the news. It's the stuff, in our view, of a strongman president. And we can talk and kind of unpack what we mean by that and what its relationship is to democracy and to the rule of law. But what I want to do in these initial comments is suggest that if we want to make sense of how we ended up here, the place to begin is not in 2015 when Donald Trump comes down the elevator and announces his intention to run. That's not the starting point. And it's a mistake when thinking about the extraordinary changes to the American presidency that we've seen to fixate on the individual that is Donald Trump. And we tell a story in this book that doesn't begin in 2015, it goes back a century prior and tries to unpack some fundamental changes to American government that have had profound implications for the title of the book, the trajectory of power that presidents wield. And I want to give you just a kind of a sketch of what the argument looks like. And it's an argument that starts by focusing squarely on the administrative state. We're in a government shutdown. There's no more part of the administrative state there's no more part of the government that's more affected in a government shutdown than the administrative state, the federal bureaucracy, the departments and bureaus and agencies that are charged with doing all kinds of things, from landing planes to attending to the national forestry to overseeing schools to dispersing Social Security checks and on and on and on. This administrative state was born of the Progressive period, primarily, and then it expanded more in the New Deal under FDR. And where the story of the book begins is in just recognizing the extraordinary expansion of the state itself, just in terms of its size, that bears upon the presidency, because what that gives to the president, this apparatus, is all kinds of manpower and authority and resources that the president can deploy. But notice that the federal bureaucracy, and Trump feels this, the federal bureaucracy isn't just standing at attention to the president, to any president who occupies office. And so what we saw for about 60 years in the aftermath of the building of this administrative state was a concerted effort by Democratic and Republican presidents alike to try to exercise control over this bureaucracy, to build what's been often thought of as the institutional presidency. These are mechanisms to try to exercise some measure of influence over the direction of the administrative state. And that has redounded to the benefit of Democratic and Republican presidents alike. That's sort of chapter 1 of the story that we're telling. Right? It's about growing federal bureaucracy. Presidents want to exercise control over it, and so Democratic and Republican presidents alike try to build out instruments of control. A lot of work there. The heart of the book, though, looks different. The heart of the book says, notice that the federal bureaucracy is not just large. It also was constructed by Democrats, big D Democrats, and employs big D Democrats, and attends to, not exclusively, but in no small measure, the interests of progressives. And these are sort of facts about the history of the rise of the administrative state that were met with extraordinary opposition from word go by conservatives. They said, we don't like this, we don't want this, and we want to shut this down. An important thing happens in their opposition by conservatives between the New Deal and I'm going to say through Nixon's presidency, that there's widespread opposition from conservative ranks, but conservatives are in the fringes of our national politics, at least when it comes to presidential politics. But the Republican Party makes a turn, and a really important turn, in the mid-'70s, wherein they recognize that, what are they going to do about these predominantly progressive elements of the administrative state that they can't extricate, they can't unearth, they can't do away with. No matter how well they do in Congress, no matter how well they do in the latest presidential election, what they do is they say, what we need is to focus our attention on the presidency and build a presidency of extraordinary power. That's our ticket, right? That's our ticket for how do we deal with these progressive elements of an administrative state that they oppose. And one more minute. I'm going to push that. I'm going to see if I can squeeze, see how much I can squeeze out of it. Strongman president. Okay, yeah. There's a set of arguments that come out, and then what you see in the Reagan presidency, and particularly in the Justice Department of the American presidency, is an effort to build up something that was called the unitary executive theory, that is an altogether rereading of Article 2 of the Constitution, which there are different versions of it. It starts out moderate to say the president has the power to appoint. The president also ought to have the power to remove, right? And that starts there and quickly gets ever larger, is to say, well, the president alone has the executive power. The president, by virtue of having the executive power, means that everybody within this vast administrative state necessarily serves at the pleasure of the president. Oh, and in order to execute the law, one has to be able to interpret the law. And because the president alone has the power to execute, then the president and the president alone has the power to interpret what law means. And it gets larger and larger and larger, ever more expansive. And this is, in no small part, again, born of a political effort to attend to a political problem that conservatives face, which is the administrative state, significant portions of it, is something that they don't like. What are they to do about it? Two more big waves come in. One is rising extremism on the left, but also along the right. So that anger that is felt by conservatives towards the progressive elements of the administrative state between 1970 and the present period only becomes more intense, right? That, coupled with the rise of populism. The rise of populism on the right, populism is, at its core, anti-institutional in its orientation, right? It's about how do we break things that have led us astray. So you have these layers, right? Rising extremism, rising populism, a concerted effort to attend to this problem on the administrative state, which all lays the groundwork for this present moment. Strongman president.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Andy.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, to have an excuse to venture all the way south of Portland and see all of you good people. Thanks to all of our hosts here, including our president and all of their staff. This has been a great opportunity to have a chance to engage with a really thought-provoking book. You should buy the book. It's lively and clearly written. I will say it's not optimistic. You're going to get to page 261 and there's no happy ending there, but it's something we should be grappling with as a country. I should note, probably, I'm not in full disagreement at all with the way that Will has developed this thesis. I'm going to just say Will, even though it's Will and Terry, his co-author, just for sake of simplicity. But I guess I should say, in a sense, I want to welcome Will to the side of presidential skepticism. I wrote a book in 2005 called The New Imperial Presidency, worried about the growth of presidential power. And I should note that Will's 2016 book with Terry Moe, the first in the series he mentioned, the subtitle is Why We Need a More Powerful Presidency. Now, Will say that I'm cheating here, a little bit of a cheap shot. He's not wrong, actually. I'm teasing mostly because the reforms that he mentions in that book are actually kind of important to the thesis that I want to lay out in my remarks and in our conversation. But again, maybe one lesson that political scientists have found out for years now is that you should be careful what you wish for. Not a bad lesson. Let me lay out just 2 or 3 quick themes in terms of what Will has mentioned. I guess I would certainly can't disagree that the growth of the administrative state is a huge part of the power of the presidency over time. It wasn't necessarily built to be presidency friendly. The civil service is a clear indication of that, and it wasn't liberal in that sense. This is pre-progressive movement, really. James Garfield is not a progressive in the way we think of Woodrow Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt. But the growth of regulatory commissions, efforts to buffer parts of this bureaucracy from the president become an important story in that they represent presidential weakness, something they can't control. And of course, presidents push back through the growth of the institutional presidency that's beautifully laid out in the book in terms of trying to be able to control what they can control, because so much of government seems to be out of their control. I would argue, I suppose, I think the conservative backlash is a little bit half-hearted in that it does lead to more presidential control from both sides of the aisle, the progressives and those who flow from a notion of scientific management, which was popular in the early 20th century, that you can arrange government to do the right things in an apolitical way. You know, they tend to glorify executive leadership, but so do conservatives who want to see more business practices and more executive-centered management brought into government. So somebody like Herbert Hoover, right, who's anti-statist, but he's also very pro-presidency when it comes to thinking about how you would revise this executive branch to make it more management-friendly. Another aspect of the story is really Congress, and this is something that's less in this book. To be fair, it's in the other 2 books that Will and Terry have written. But Congress has a big part to play in this. They create the bureaucracy, of course. They pass the laws. They fund the bureaucracy. And over this period, they give presidents a lot of power. So when we're talking about a strongman president, we're not wresting power entirely. There's a lot in the statute books that allows that allows presidents to look at the vagaries of legislative language and to move aggressively in that direction. Now, sometimes this is for bad reason. Congress is lazy. They don't necessarily want to, they're not able to predict every eventuality, certainly, and sometimes they don't try all that hard. Congress can be parochial, don't necessarily have the broader national interest in mind, but also, sometimes they do, in fact, think that, in fact, the president is the better institution to give this power to. A colleague of ours, John Dearborn at Vanderbilt, has written convincingly about the growth of key elements of the bureaucracy going back to the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. And Congress really did feel that this was better in the presidency, right? This power would be given. But what this delegation means over time, right, is that presidents do have an interest, not even in passing new laws, but in finding new meaning in all the old laws that have been passed. And so I think if we look to the present day, I see less divergence by party, maybe, than in Will's argument. He talks about an asymmetric argument here, and I think there's something to it for sure, especially in the mass parties. But presidents themselves seem to back away less from exercising that power, even if they give it different names. Right? Barack Obama said he was not going to use prerogative power. He rejected some of the implications of unitary executive theory when it came to legal opinions. He said he was going to follow the power he had from the law and the Constitution, but it turned out that he had all the power he could want somewhere in the laws or the Constitution. The practical difference between what he wanted to do and found the power to do vested in these laws and what George W. Bush, who claimed an inherent power to act beyond the law, could do varied on the margins, maybe. We see this in Libya and the War Powers Resolution. We see it in the authorization for the use of military force and how that was expanded over time. We see it in the Immigration and Nationality Act, the Affordable Care Act. We could go back to a number of things where, again, Democratic presidents, and you go back to the political science literature of 2013 to 15, you'll see a lot of worry, among political scientists about the executive overreach, even of the Obama administration. So that's part of, I think, where I would push back just a little, or at least a little bit perpendicular to Will's argument. The other piece is, up front, the authors say this is not a book about Trump. I think, and maybe this is good news, actually, it is kind of about Trump. Because if presidents of both powers are doing this, but within, again, the discretion granted to them in law, what should we say when we do have a president pushing past that discretion and honestly acting in ways that violate the letter of the law? Often, Trump has acted to push past actions just a little bit further, sometimes to their logical conclusion. In that, again, I don't think we see him as qualitatively different than past presidents, and we see even in the dubious interpretations of things like the Alien Enemies Act, at least an attempt to hook action to statute. So that's even in the second term. If we look at, for example, something very friendly to higher ed or familiar to people in higher ed, right? The book points out that government employment is flatlined over the last 6 decades or so. What that means, because the budget certainly has risen, is that presidents have more grant authority, power over the federal spending than they have ever had, and that can be used in quite discretionary ways as well. And then finally, just to sort of wrap up here, though I hope we'll come back to some of these points, is that Donald Trump, yes, it's true, he would like to eviscerate parts of the administrative state, but he likes parts of it too. He's actually a little bit of a different kind of Republican. In 2016, he embraced huge parts of the welfare state, including Social Security and Medicare. And so when we talk about, presidents of this genre wanting to tear down capacity, partly true, certainly in areas that are not tied to presidential preferences, but even in areas you might not expect, like the Department of Education, you need people there to go harass Harvard, right? You need people there who are going to accuse every school they can find of whatever they can find in existing law as a violation of the federal grants that they've received. So one question you could ask is, if on January 10th or so, 2021, the Senate had actually acted on the House impeachment of Donald Trump, barred him from retaining office, right? Whether the world today would look like it does, whether the inexorable logic is quite so inexorable without the specific personage of Donald Trump there.
Thank you. Thank you both. So we're going to have a discussion up here now for a little bit of time, and then we'll be opening it up to audience questions later. But I think I want to go straight to what brought most of you to this room this evening, and those of you online, hello. Hi, Dad. Is Donald Trump a strongman president, and is our democracy in peril? And I'd just like to read from the opening chapter of Will's book, which I think has a very lovely and succinct description or definition of a strongman, which is a word that we use a lot in political science circles, but I haven't heard very much out in the general chatter in the media. I hear the words authoritarian and dictator, but I haven't heard that word strongman. So just to put the definition out for the group, a president who would exercise unilateral power untethered to traditional democratic norms and procedures. So in other words, not subject to the limits imposed by the separation of powers. So I'd like to each of you, and I'd ask that we keep our answers tonight not too long so we can get to many questions. And I'll turn to you first, Will. Let's take these two separately. Is Donald Trump a strongman president?
Yes.
Andy, do you agree?
Yes.
Yes. Is our democracy in peril?
Yes.
I'm a little more optimistic on that front.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's explore that. Andy, why is our democracy in peril? Is it more than the obvious, which is that Donald Trump is behaving like a strongman president, and the separation of powers doesn't seem to be restricting him in that, or is it more?
So another definition that we offer in the book is the definition of democracy itself, and it's one that thinks more capaciously about democracy than just whether or not we have free and fair elections, although put a pin in that. It's also about the rule of law. And part of what a strongman presidency is a threat to the rule of law. This plays out in lots of places. Let me talk about it as it relates to the administrative state, which, again, we think the arguments for a vastly more powerful presidency that are born on the right, starting in the mid-'70s, is to attend to a very real problem. I mean, it's a real problem that when you look at an administrative state that has these big progressive components, and what do we do? Congress isn't equipped to, or the courts aren't adequately equipped to offer a perceived corrective, which is why they then say what we need is a vastly, vastly more powerful president. The work of that vastly, vastly more powerful president, in no small part, is being put to the purposes not just of reigning in government, but sabotaging government. It's about, there are real debates to be had about what the EPA should be doing. There's a conservative and a progressive reading about what that mandate is. Our argument is that we're in a state right now wherein the powers of the presidency are being put to the purpose of kneecapping the agency. Not just putting it in a position where it will do things that are different from what the original mandate was. It's about making it incapable of fulfilling any basic notion about what that objective is, and that objective is written into law. And in that sense, what we have then is an assault on the rule of law. It's that you have an administrative state that is created by Congress in no small part, that's fulfilling mandates that are written into law, that when there's an all-out assault on the administrative state, you have a kind of lawlessness, which in our view is deeply problematic, which is antithetical to a healthy, well-functioning democracy.
I so appreciate your bringing up the point of the rule of law, because teaching political science or history, what most of us learn in those classrooms is that many Americans, certainly young Americans, have a single definition of democracy, which is the vote. And of course, the rule of law is so central to it. Any rejoinders or difference?
Well, I guess again, to expand on a point I made, the rule of law is a little bit tricky because the laws are very vague and generous, honestly, to the president in a lot of cases. When President Trump's travel ban came up in the first term to the Supreme Court, the court looked at the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1950-something and said, the section he's using, quote, exudes deference to the president, unquote. And there are a lot of areas in the law where that kind of generous grant of power has been given. If we look at, things that the current president is doing with regards to declaring emergencies, I think objectively, very few of these things, if any, are actual emergencies, and the courts are trying to work their way through that problem. But it's not clear in the law that objective emergency is required, right? Does there have to be an emergency, or does the president just have to declare one? You can think of the substantive reason for the former, but that's not necessarily what the law says. So you've got a lot of room within the law to do damage to the norms that we have. It might be legal to send troops to Los Angeles. It doesn't make it a good idea.
Right. So is it a war or not? Open to interpretation within the law?
Well, here's another question. So back in the Obama administration, I mentioned this in passing, the War Powers Resolution came up. This was passed in the 1970s as a rejoinder to President Nixon and Johnson, right, who had expanded the war in Vietnam effectively unilaterally. And the idea was that if American troops were placed into hostilities, that's the word in the law, that there would be the requirement for congressional approval, that without it, the troops would have to be removed. It turns out that the word hostilities can be redefined in ways that help a presidential agenda, and the current state of presidential law, right, starting really with the Obama administration's efforts in Libya in 2011, but continuing through the Trump administration in Syria and the Biden administration in Yemen, and back to the Trump administration in all sorts of places, including attacks on fishing boats, off of Venezuela, is to say that these are not hostilities for the purposes of the War Power Resolution. Hostilities must mean something the size of Vietnam. And so if it's not, quote, war in a constitutional sense, then that is within the president's purview. Now, we're getting to a whole bigger question about the role of Congress, I hope, but that's where we stand in terms of the text of that law.
Yeah. Sure.
So this is great. So statutes are ambiguous. Article 2 is ambiguous. In that ambiguity, there's a long history of presidents reading in all kinds of discretion, presidents on the left and the right. Absolutely true. And that's the stuff of normal politics. I mean, that's the stuff of the politics that we saw, I would argue, pre-2016. What we've seen over the last 9 months is very different. And I want to be clear, this is not a story about conservatives being wrong and progressives being right, or vice versa in terms of their core principles or what they think is the right policy. That's not the argument here. The kind of targeting of political enemies that we're observing, all the things that DOJ did, the deployment currently of troops into the south side of Chicago where I live, at the objection of a mayor and a governor, in the service of serving as a training ground for our troops when they go wage war abroad. When the personal enrichment that we're observing, the particular claims that are being made on behalf of unbounded presidential power, this is different. This is not regular presidential politics. And if you hate the purposes to which they're currently being put, I think that sort of resonates automatically. Imagine if Obama were to do the same things, right? Imagine and use the same rationales. This is not the same. And so I would argue we don't want to slip into a kind of false equivalence when we draw these comparisons across presidents. And this is where the book has some real bite to it, is that we argue that the threat of a strongman presidency sits squarely on the right now. And it's born, again, of a set of arguments that were coming out from the mid-'70s that then led to the arguments on behalf of the unitary executive theory, which is a project of the right to deal with a very real political problem they face, which is there is this huge administrative state, which has large components which are progressive in orientation, and what to do about that when Congress and the courts aren't up to the task. In that sense, like you can see, it's a real problem, but the project of pushing for a vastly, vastly more powerful presidency is coming from the right, and which is then why Democrats have not been the protagonists in the story of that construction. Now, we talk about it in the conclusion. They also haven't adequately, in our view, spoken out against it, and when they've been in power, rolled it back. They've been willing to sort of let it sit on the side. Last thing I'll say, which is that Democrats don't need a presidency of extraordinary power, because when the administrative state is simply doing its work, they're happy. And you got 3 political scientists up here. If what you want to do is unearth the status quo, you want to change a set of current practices, you need more power. And if what you want to do is just protect a set of certain practices, a certain set of organizations, you need less power. Democrats need less power when it comes to the presidency because the administrative state serves their interests.
Yeah, the final chapter of this book lays that out very well. Oh, I had a big question, but I just want to do a follow-up on that. First of all, do you agree that this is largely a Republican president crime, if we can call it that, to democracy? And second, do you agree that the administrative state is this largely progressive behemoth that William is describing? Because I'm thinking, for example, there are certainly corners of the federal government that aren't necessarily progressive, and the military has grown enormously at the same time, not known for its progressive values. So I'm just on those 2 points.
Secretary of Defense, by the way, it's the Department of Defense, would disagree with you about the progressive values in the military. He's trying to root them out, apparently. But
no, I'm saying that they're not a progressive organization. Yeah.
I know you're saying that. He thinks they've become far too much so.
And too heavy, yeah.
But, yeah. Well, so a couple points. One, national crimes. I mean, again, this is why I was stressing sort of a little bit of divergence from the asymmetrical logic that the book lays out, this idea that the parties have diverged strongly, because I think, again, in practice, presidents as a whole, and remember, we have a small n here. This is one of the perpetual problems of studying the presidency, is that, those who are fond of statistical analyses can rarely do it by president. You've got to look for other kinds of processes that are repeated across presidencies. And so I am very happy to sit here and say that Donald Trump has violated the law in many instances in the last 9 months. Will has named some of those instances. But again, this is why I suggested in some ways this is a Donald Trump story, and maybe not a Republican Party story to the extent, at least, that the book lays out. Mm-hmm. I'd be a little less confident pushing that. But again, our N is very small. Our N is 2 if we go back to George W. Bush, or 4 if we go back to Ronald Reagan. But I think we could find some key distinguishing features in Reagan and certainly in the first Bush administration, and the book certainly will talk about those, that make them consistently different from what we've seen. And even in W. Bush, I think you've got differences than in Trump. So, I mean, the answer in a way is, if it's Trump, yes, he wants to harm the EPA, right? But even there, they're going through the motions, at least, of dismantling regulation. They've come up with I wouldn't say very scientific study, but an effort to undercut the endangerment finding that shows that carbon emissions are harmful to human health. There is sort of a process here that's being followed, again, consistent with law. Maybe the law needs to be stronger. And so, there are some of these things that are happening, but again, there are aspects of this larger government that the current president would be very happy to keep. He wants Social Security funding. He ran on that that's just one reason he was different than other Republicans in 2016, that he was all in favor of spending. And by the way, Social Security is a huge amount of money. It's not a very big bureaucracy. And so there are different aspects of where the money is flowing through that are a little bit, so we can get to cost cutting versus attacking the bureaucracy per se, maybe in ways that are importantly distinct.
So our Constitution has the separation of powers designed to prevent the reality or the picture that you're painting and you largely agree with. You especially talk about how Congress gave up its power and ceded it to the president. You talk more about the growth of the administrative state. Either way, I'm fascinated by why 2 bodies, the courts, but especially Congress, filled with political actors who want nothing more than to exercise power, would let this happen. So one of the joys about being around presidential political scientists is they're incredibly good historians, as you can tell. So why would politically oriented people give up their power?
because they're politically oriented and they don't have strong incentives to protect the prerogatives of their institution. When you think about legislators, think about what's going to keep them elected and stay in office. And they have a short period of time to demonstrate a record of accomplishment that they can come home to their districts or their states and to say, look, I did something on behalf of you. And the political calculus is one that doesn't lead them to say, I should devote my scarce time and resources to fight for the good people of Maine by ensuring that the president abides by the War Powers Resolution, as opposed to attending to the local interests of the people of Maine. And so with Massachusetts, and so with Pennsylvania. And so the story of congressional abdication to presidential power is a long one. And a lot of then what the work of political scientists do, and I think Andy and I, each of in our own way, have tried to figure out, well, shoot, sometimes that's a problem for the president, and sometimes it opens up opportunities for the president when you think about these separation of powers issues. Because if what the president wants is to pass a bill through Congress and to say, here, deal with this issue precisely because Congress is parochial in its orientation, it's very difficult for them to push things through, which is why in the last, in no small part, the last 15 years, when we've seen big laws, it's almost always through the reconciliation process, through the budget process. It's like one big, giant amalgamation of a bunch of stuff, and it gets through, but there aren't opportunities one at a time to debate presidential initiatives and to weigh the pros and cons of them. I'll say, because I can't resist, that subtitle of the book that Andy referenced about why we need a more powerful presidency, the thing that we were arguing for there was agenda-setting power for the president. Let's let the president come forward and introduce something that Congress would then have to vote on, because our concern was that the legislative process was so corrupted, so broken. It was not a story about a vast expansion of unilateral powers, which is what we're seeing and which is the stuff of a strongman presidency.
Thank you. What would you add or change to that story?
Well, I think I agree wholly with Will in that political actors act in their political interest as they perceive it. And so to the degree that members of Congress see no advantage in upholding the prerogatives of their institution, that's a problem with the wider political system in a lot of ways. That's obviously becomes a big indictment, and we can, if we have time, verge our way into thinking about reforms of congressional selection, because perhaps the answer really is that we are in an Article I crisis, Congress, as much as we're in an Article II crisis, the presidency.
So it's rooted in the fact that individual legislators are motivated by getting reelected on the small and local issues, not on protecting congressional oversight of the presidency.
Generally, they want to get reelected. Even if they have better motives in mind, if what they want to do ultimately is to save the world, they have to get reelected to do that. And that's going to be what they're going to aim for first. So if the good people of the 1st District of Maine are not telling their representative that what we really care about is issues of presidential overreach, and rarely in American history has that been the primary issue for any constituency, right?
Maybe until today.
Well, we're getting there. We're working on that. But also think of, again, gerrymandering was mentioned, right? Maine doesn't have the geographic and population ability to gerrymander very effectively. But plenty of states do, right? And now you're talking about districts where you're getting very little inter-party competition and therefore even less incentive to push back against a president of your own party. And this is something that, again, I think the framers didn't expect, right? Madison in Federalist 51 famously talks about ambition counteracting ambition. Your loyalty would be to the place, right? Your institution, the House, the Senate,
right.
Presidency. That is much less true in an era of very unified, strong parties where polarization seems to rule so much of our behavior.
Mm-hmm. And social media makes everything national.
Doesn't help.
Yeah. So, Will, your book, it's so historically rooted in how we got to this place. I almost felt like at the end, we have the imperiled democracy and strongman presidency that our democracy allowed to happen. Is that a fair summary or conclusion or title?
Yes, that it's helpful to take a cue from what's happened abroad here. The story of democratic backsliding abroad, particularly in the last half century, it's not a story of coups or of military takeovers. It's a story of democratically elected heads of states, presidents, claiming power, often by offering very real critiques of a political order that had failed the people in an important respect. And in that sense, it can be democratically enhancing, the first move. But what then happens is a degradation of checks, not just opposition to the judiciary or the legislature, but an unwillingness to recognize the legitimacy of a judiciary or an executive and the checks that they might offer. An effort to break apart a free and independent press. A targeted effort to single out political enemies, sometimes as individuals and sometimes as law firms, and to go after them. This is a story that has played out in other democracies, and it's been the stuff of backsliding that's happened abroad. And I think we've become inured to the notion through this belief in American exceptionalism that it won't happen here. And the story that we want to tell here is that the seeds of this go way back, and they speak to big kind of tectonic forces in our politics. It's not a story, and maybe this is a place where we differ. For us, it's a story that's about parties and about arguments that go way back, and the rise of the administrative state that has a particular inflection, not all the way through, but important dimensions of it have a particular inflection that have set in motion big forces that aren't going away when Trump goes away, which is why what led us initially to write this book was there was a sense in 2020 that he lost, and we saw these Democrats sort of sighing and saying it's all good. And in our view, the way to think about Trump is to think about populism and to think about the structural forces that were in place that allowed and supported these efforts were very much locked in. And so they are going forward.
And would you say, I wonder if part of what he just described, and would you agree, is because of so much of our misunderstanding about democracy in this country and equating it with solely on who gets elected. And so people think, well, Trump was elected, so he has the power and the right and the authority to pretty much do anything. And we don't have a civic understanding rooted either in how our government works or even how the population thinks about things like checks and balances and rule of law and so forth.
Yeah, well, I certainly think the notion that democracy can be imbued in multiple branches at once is an important thing to keep in mind, and something that the White House would very much like you not to think about right now. If you look at even yesterday, descriptions of, well, why can the president do what he's doing against these activist judges who are trying to stop him? The answer is the colossal landslide of 2024. Right now, I mean, as a mathematical description, that's just a flat-out lie, let's face it. But this notion of popular sovereignty as important to presidential power is something that presidents have been trying to use for a long time, and that in the past, other institutions have pushed back against. It is worth keeping in mind. You know, President Trump has never received 50% of the popular vote in any election. He has never been above 50% in the Gallup poll, going back to 2017 to 21 and starting again in 2025. His individual policies poll even worse than that. So the notion that there is indeed, we should think about this as a majority vote question is a problem, actually, for the Trump administration, which is why the question gets changed. What is exceptional, or one thing that's exceptional about America, though, is that minority rule is possible. Our institutions allow that. And if they don't exercise themselves to prevent it in ways that we've already talked about, Congress failing rather dismally to do so far, then you're going to have a problem. But again, the notion that Congress has democratic legitimacy is important to keep in mind. And in fact, their election is seen by the framers as far closer to the people. Remember, the Electoral College is a buffer against popular opinion having any hold on the presidency. When Andrew Jackson starts talking about democracy being his power, people like Henry Clay, great Whig statesman of the time, says the president has no power that's not in the Constitution. This whole talk about a mandate is ridiculous. Well, Jackson kind of wins that argument over time, but I still think you probably do have to have popular support to move in these directions. I think some of the European leaders Will talks about do actually, or at least did, maybe have more popular support, at least when they started, but we have seen that in some places like Poland flip over. The question, though, is can the institutions be changed to prevent that from mattering?
That is a perfect segue to my next question for both of you. Is our democracy beyond the point of no return? And if not, what has to happen to bring it back to a semblance of something that the Constitution calls for?
You take that first.
It's your book. Yeah, well, I don't think so, actually. And I said earlier I was slightly more optimistic maybe about the peril. And partly that does link to what I was just talking about, the sheer unpopularity, actually, in the wider world. I mean the United States, of President Trump's efforts here and the way that they framed him, again, rather gleefully, as a king. Right? I do think that while we overestimate sort of this notion, again, of American exceptionalism, nothing could go wrong here because we believe in the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence, of course, besides the pretty stuff at the beginning, is 90% about why monarchy is bad and tyrannical. And so I think it fits rather poorly. The White House back in February sent out a big social media post with President Trump wearing a crown. Long live the king, it said. Well, I grew up at a time when Schoolhouse Rock was on TV every Saturday morning, and one of those cartoons was called No More Kings. I do think some of that residual resistance remains, and not for
But
nothing.
if it's residual...
Well, no, I mean, it deep in the... Not residual in the sense of a rounding error or an error, in a regression equation. I'm saying, deep in the hearts of Americans, right? And sort of, I'm trying to say there actually, I think, still exists this resistance to the notion that the president ought to be king. That's what I'm saying. And indeed, there's some research that I think the book does not quote. It quotes some research by Doug Kreiner and Dino Christensen, which is very good work about Americans kind of saying, well, kingship's bad, but if my president does it, then it's good, and if the other party's president does it, then it's dictatorship. There's also some alternate work that suggests, this is by Andrew Reeves and John Rogowski, that suggests, well, actually, we don't think it is instrumental. We have research that suggests that people really are, in principle, find executive overreach problematic, that they don't like unilateral action, and that they, in fact, so there is, I hope they're right, to be honest, because I think that's where, in the end, this comes from. The sort of house of cards of popular support crashes down.
Okay, so you're expecting that the non-regal, the anti-royal sentiments, the democratic hearts of American voters will eventually prevail. But if, sorry, I'm speaking for you, if the state has been so changed and the gerrymandering happens, can that sentiment prevail?
No, that's a real problem. I mean, we've seen it in Europe, the shifting of institutions, the weakening of judicial independence, things like that, to support at least, a soft version of authoritarianism. I don't think we're there yet in the United States, but I do think that, we have to look to the judiciary to do a task it's not really equipped for, which is to push back against these assertions of presidential power, things that judges, they don't like to be put in these kinds of positions. And really shouldn't have to be. Again, my preferred option, right, longer term, would be reform of how members of Congress are elected, the expansion of the House, the elimination of congressional districts. Actually, we can go all into this direction. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires you to be elected from a tiny piece of land within a state, for example. So I do think there is some reason for hope here, but it will take, reform. I do think that, again, my counterfactual I mentioned at the beginning, I am hopeful but not entirely confident that, again, this is in a way a story about Donald Trump, that he very cleverly picked up on trends that were absolutely occurring, but that he has pushed them further than any other individual would. And that, if you think again, had the Senate done its job, in my view, and made Donald Trump ineligible to run again in 2024, that, whoever you can think of who's now in that office, whether it's Ron DeSantis or, Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, I don't know, but let's assume a Republican won, would they be acting in exactly the same way? I think actually not. The cult of personality, honestly, is a piece of this. And, I can't really imagine driving by a rural lot festooned in thousands of dollars of DeSantis merchandise. I just don't quite see it.
I couldn't imagine that for Trump in 2015. Yeah. So are we beyond the point of no return? And if not, what has to happen?
Things aren't deterministic. We have agency. So I don't want to lock this down too much. But for the purposes of underscoring difference between, I think, our disposition, where we would see things going, I think I have a dimmer view of how this is going to shake out. We, in the final chapter of this book, kind of walk through where's the check going to come from. We spend a bunch of time thinking about the American public. Are they going to constitute an independent check? And for a bunch of reasons we lay out there, I think probably not. Congress as an institution, don't hold your breath. The courts are ill-equipped to constitute a meaningful check on strongman presidency. One, moreover, the Supreme Court has a bunch of justices who really believe in that unitary executive theory that I was pointing to earlier.
Even though it's not in the Constitution, and that's their guiding light.
No, but it's their view how you should read the Constitution, which is to read in Article 2 unbelievable power, capacious power, which we are not constitutional law scholars. Your modal constitutional law scholar would say this is extreme and unfounded, but it has taken hold. It's gained real purchase. Let me add two more reasons, though, why I have a dimmer view. One has to do with transformations of the Republican Party, that there were, in the lead up to the 2024 elections, a whole bunch of people looking to carry the torch, right? To behave as Trump did. And the Republican Party is the party of Trump in ways that the Democratic Party was never the party of Biden or the party of Obama. That there are profound partisan changes that are happening there that we need to keep an eye on, which make me think that, no, J.D. Vance is ready to carry this forward in 2028. And so we're not going to get relief if what you're worried about, and again, this is not a story about who has the right policy. This is not about the progressives should feeling good because they have the right answers for the challenges that we face as a country. This is a story about power and how it's wielded in a democracy. And so I in my view, J.D. Vance is ready to go. Point number one. Point number two is when you think about a real check, in our first two books, we're trying to participate in the kinds of deliberations you were just pointing to, which is about how we need to rethink our institutions. We need to redesign our government. That's really hard work. That requires us to put down our rhetoric and put down our distrust and try to reason from first principles about how do we come together? How do we overcome our disagreements? How do we design our bodies of government in ways that make sense, allow us to productively move forward? And we are so far from that space. And that's a great lament. I mean, I would love nothing more. When I think what would be the healthiest thing for our government would be a new progressive period, not because they got it right at all. And the story isn't about bigger government, but that was a 30, 40-year period when there were live debates about how should we elect people? How should we pass laws? Profound changes happened then that brought together people who sat in different places in the political spectrum, which in my view was incredibly healthy. And we're just so far from being able to have those kinds of deliberations.
I'd like to ask, both of you said the same thing. You said our courts are not equipped to deal with this. I'd like you to speak more about that and tell us why not. Because just as a consumer of the popular press and just reading about this, we're told that the courts are our only savior from an imperial presidency. And that it's and all these lawsuits and injunctions and everything, and always waiting with bated breath on what the Supreme Court or other parts of the federal judiciary are going to do. So, if not them, who? But actually, my first question: why are they ill-equipped? I mean, they're one of the three branches, co-equal.
They are. Well, actually, I would say the branches are not co-equal. Congress has more power than anybody else. Congress can fire the president. The fact that we can't talk seriously about that as a possibility in the last number of years is actually a real problem, too. But Congress is Article 1 for a reason, so I would start there. The courts, though, they have a very important role, of course, but their role is to answer cases and controversies that come before them, and those are brought by people who have a specific problem. They have standing to bring a case because they've been harmed somehow by the action of another actor, in these cases government actors. And so, it is true certainly that especially as you get to the Supreme Court level, you're setting policy. You're setting, making laws wholesale in a certain way. But it's not a job that's really for the court to rule on questions that are not before them. It's not to say the Supreme Court especially doesn't sometimes succumb to that temptation, but their job is to answer the case before them in the terms of the laws that have been passed. And as I've mentioned, a lot of those laws, if they're, again, the answer for me is for Congress to come back and write better laws, honestly. But in the absence of that, the courts need to work with what they have. And in a lot of cases, we've seen, especially the Supreme Court, very generously put its thumb on the scale for presidential discretion in these areas. Will's absolutely right about the unitary executive theory being pushed far past, I think, its original, trial run as something that was mostly about personnel in the executive branch to a much broader adoption of power. And in this vein, we could mention the 2024 decision of the Supreme Court to grant the president criminal immunity from any acts committed in office, effectively. That, I think, is a very troubling decision that goes against history and against the way that even presidents understood the law to work before that time. So in that sense, a big gift, to presidents moving forward that, rests again on this notion, as Chief Justice Roberts has said, that the president is the only branch of government who is also an individual person. And as should be clear by now, the executive branch is not an individual person. It goes far beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, that was great. No, I think that's right. The courts Hamilton called them the least dangerous branch. They lack the power of the purse. They lack the power of the sword. And so what they can do is they can render their judgment. And that in the rendering of judgment, that has a real political currency. That can matter a bunch in checking presidential power. The question is, are they up to the task of checking a strongman president? Somebody who is intent upon plowing through whatever stands in the president's way. Here's something for us to watch and to try to make sense of when we think about the courts in particular. We have a judge who was appointed by Trump in his first term coming out saying you can't send troops into Portland.
The other Portland.
The other Portland. Forgot where I am. The other Portland on the West Coast. And that may be overturned on appeal. We'll have to see. What is to happen, though, in a world in which it isn't appealed, that judicial ruling stands, and Trump comes forward and says, I'm going to do it anyway, because I have an obligation to, and we can fill in what the argument would be, stand up for law and order and protect the well-being of the people, and I have this duty as president to push forward. Imagine, what are the courts to do in response?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Right. If I could just add one very quick thing there. I mean, you were talking about the military earlier. I mean, one answer would be for the members of the military to say, well, you've just issued an illegal order, right, which is extraordinarily rare. It would be a very, we'd really put a lot of things to the test in that circumstance. And, I hope we'd like the answer.
Yep.
Okay, on that, let's move to, thank you both very much. Let's move to our audience questions.
My question's for both of you. What about governors and of states? States have sovereign responsibilities, and their subdivisions, the municipalities and the mayors have certain rights under the law. What about governors? And do the governors hold? I'm thinking, what's to stop a president from sending Black Hawk helicopters into a city, have people jump out of that city and pull people out of their beds at night and zip tie them? Can the governor do anything about that to protect the people?
This is appearing less and less than a hypothetical. I mean, again, I left this morning, I hopped on a plane, I live on the south side of Chicago, and we're thinking about the communities there. It's governors and a mayor too that steadfastly opposes what's happening. And you see the nationalization of the Guard that's being deployed into a city, and what's to come of that. The governors are not incidental in that they can play a role in organizing, in messaging. They have a political currency. But I don't like their chances either. When you think, unless there is some systemic, coordinated effort that goes just beyond the formal powers that a governor wields in trying to resist the efforts of a strong man to coalesce national power, military power, to collapse judicial, executive, and legislative power into a single entity for their own private purposes. I mean, I think your question lingers. It's sort of, what about governors? What about mayors? What about other local political actors? Is there work to be done? The answer is, of course, yes. And in some ways, the real answer may well come through a coordinated effort that is not just sitting in one party to push back against strongman power, but governors one at a time. Again, I don't like their chances.
Anything to add to that?
Two things briefly. One is that, federalism is another one of those things that we like more when we don't like what the federal government is doing. Over time, of course, we've built up this sort of codependency between the states and the federal government. A lot of state budgets come from federal money. And so to the degree that presidents have discretion over how that money is spent, they're going to have leverage over governors in a way that perhaps they didn't before. Another thing I'd mention in this context is the fact that it's very rare, right, for a president to override the wishes of the governor and federalize the National Guard in that governor's state. The last time we've really seen it was in the civil rights era and a number of cases where state governors refused to desegregate institutions of higher education. John F. Kennedy famously activated the Guard in Mississippi and in
But that's
Alabama.
what Trump is doing in Portland, or threatening to do.
That is indeed what he's threatening to do. The law, I mean, let me just say, federal law can be enforced by federal agents, right? You are not allowed to use the military for domestic law enforcement, according to the law. And so what is theoretically happening with these military is that they are protecting, agents, ICE agents specifically in this case, as they go about enforcing federal law. To do even that, though, you need to claim that there is an inability or unwillingness of the state or local government to enforce the law. And this is where we get into questions of fact that courts have to grapple with, and that a president willing to say there's an emergency when there's no emergency is going to have a little bit of, at least of the first mover advantage here, even if not the law on his side.
Thank you. Yes, Josh.
We have a question in back
Thank you
from
very
a
much.
student who is a med bio major and a political science minor.
Excellent.
Okay, my question is directed to both or either of you. How do you think we'll recover from an international standpoint? So when we've eliminated aid organizations and international funding, and we've seen reactions from countries all over the world towards the decisions that we've made, how do you think we'll recover in future presidencies, and how will we be seen from other countries moving forward?
I'm going to just stay on my downer note on this front, right? Which is to say that there's not going to be an automatic corrective. When you withdraw unilaterally from a set of international organizations, it compromises the capacity of those international organizations to function, and it creates deep distrust when imagine the next Democrat who comes into office and goes out and says, hey, I'm here to offer a corrective. Trust me, we'll see through whatever agreement we settle on as it relates to climate change or trade or any number of issues, technology, and how we're going to deal with the AI revolution that's underway that is not going to respect national borders in clean, neat ways. There's every reason to believe that abroad they're going to be looking upon us with deep skepticism, no matter what the well wishes are of an ex-president, even if she or he wholly tries to distance herself or himself from a Trump presidency. These things endure in the same way. Last thing I'll say is that the assault that we're seeing right now domestically on the administrative state will endure. It plays out in a similar kind of way. It's not like you can then just reassemble the pieces and say, all right, the lights are back on and we're going to get back after it. The damage lingers.
Do you have anything to add?
Well, I would say you should flip your minor and your major, obviously. But also, I would agree, we have sort of a ping-pong effect. The use of unilateral action especially is problematic for the stability of U.S. commitments abroad, which makes people trust us less. And of course, in the short term, countries in places where people have been relying on U.S. aid and are now, in some cases dying because of its absence, are going to find that hard to forget, I think.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, this is for either one or both of you. What do you see as the role of money in all of this? Political donations, international money that is going into presidential campaigns or whatever. Thank you.
Why don't we hear from one of you?
Yeah, that's you, Will.
Briefly, this is one where there's a reason why I haven't said money is a problem yet. It's not because I don't think, there's a long list of things to note. Here's what I'd say. This is a topic that's been studied really carefully by political scientists for a long time, and they don't find a tremendous amount of evidence that systematically people are being bought and sold as a function of the checks that are being written. There's a lot of really careful work that's been done on this topic. Now, the scholars that have done this work may be looking in the wrong places, and there might be big structural forces that have been unleashed that they haven't accounted for just yet. But it's not, if what you have in mind is that a handful of very rich people are buying off people in positions of power who then become puppets on behalf of the parochial interests of those oligarchs, I just don't think we have, we don't have a lot of evidence that that's what's in play. Again, that isn't to say that there aren't issues to worry about, lots of issues, and some that may involve money. But the starkest version of money being a corrosive force in our democracy is not one that I'm inclined to sign up for, on the evidence that's out there right now.
So we have time for 2 more questions. Yes.
Hi, this question is for both of you. You were talking about the kind of ambiguity in the law, and in particular, you referenced Congress and their ability and how they kind of use this to shift more power to the executive, as well as presidents reading into this discretion. And at the end, you briefly mentioned the courts and their role. You both mentioned that you thought they were ill-equipped. I was wondering what role you think that that's by their own design. In cases, you were talking about the immunity case recently at the court, Trump v. United States. I was wondering if the structural cases that have been seen at the court are actually kind of intentional in the court's gifting of that power more toward the executive, and how like court reform could also be maybe also a solution in addition to Congress reform and things that you were discussing.
So yes, I think in terms of the expansion of presidential power, often the courts have been intentional in this. Certainly, again, Will talks a lot in the book and has talked some tonight about the unitary executive theory and how that's expanded over time. And you do have, members of the court who are deeply committed to that theory of governance. That is the way they think the Constitution is meant to work, that the executive power is vested in a president, and that doesn't mean some of the executive power, to paraphrase Justice Scalia. It means all the executive power. And what does that mean? It means control over personnel, it means control over executing the law, and anything that gets in the way of that has to be illegitimate. Which means, if you follow that logic to its absolute conclusion, the civil service itself has to go. We have to go back to a system where presidents personally appoint every member of the government, right? Again, the current court has pulled its punches a little bit. It says the Federal Reserve is somehow magically exempt from this, at least so far. But every other agency, it's given signals that it's happy to move in that direction. Again, I don't think there's a historical grounding for this theory, but I do think it's intentional to the degree that it puts the president in what members of the court think is the proper place. Again, lots of us would dispute that.
So
yes, let's move to our last question. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a question directed to Will. Very interested by your historical perspective on the administrative state and the building of that, and what you seem to describe as maybe an inevitable reaction to it, which is what we're at right now. But in looking back at those laws, the New Deal, the Civil Rights Act, clean water, clean air, do you really think that if you could now, in retrospect, give advice, do you think that any of that should not have been done? I mean, how would have it been accomplished? Is it possible that there could be a safety net that we could have created within our state of Maine and not relied on the federal government to put us in the position we're at now?
So let me lean into that question. Because this is a point when Terry and I talk about this book, he's the one that usually comes forward and has you in mind, in which he says the following, and he's right, and it's in the book. It's that this is totally natural that we have a robust administrative state. And that if you look out at industrialized countries everywhere, they are more robust and more independent than our own, which is more politically vulnerable to the entreaties of a president. And we could argue the merits of any particular agency and their mandate, and there are, to my mind, there are legitimate debates to be had, sort of agency by agency. What are the right policies? right? How aggressively should they pursue one end versus another? How should they think about various trade-offs? That's the stuff of healthy politics. But to be clear, the notion, I mean, this point about the unitary executive theory being a throwback to the spoils system, the argument that what we should do is extricate the administrative state as a whole from the constitutional order, and what, right? Like, how would we have a government that functions, that actually acts upon the laws that Congress, were it healthier, and in the past it has been in various times healthier, that it passes. That this is not, and so when I say that the administrative state was created by big D Democrats, and the significant portions of it were for big D Democratic purposes, and they do employ disproportionately big D Democrats, all that is true. I mean, all that is true. And yet still, you think, is the alternative that we not have an administrative state that attends to some basic objectives that, that the public wants to see attended to? And there is a move to make, if you don't like it, which is to roll it back through law, not to take a hatchet to it through unilateral action.
Thank you. So let me just finish up here by thanking everybody for coming. It's in these times where those of us who care about our democracy, like everybody in this room, are feeling disheartened, to be able to have this event and to have scholars of your stature be studying it and helping us understand it, and have you all come out, just reminds me that we do hold our democracy dear. And although it's kind of scary how quickly it can seem to be fleeting, that you've also reminded us of many of its foundations. So thank you to President Herbert, for the President's Forum, to our two speakers especially, and to all of you for coming. Thank you so much, James.
So I want to add my thanks to both of our speakers, and Jeanne, for your moderation. So Andy and William, thank you both so much. I appreciate it. I learned a lot tonight just listening to you, and I'm not sure that I'm leaving any more optimistic, but perhaps a bit more enlightened. So thank you both, and thanks to all of you for coming, and especially to the students for your awesome questions. I'm so proud of you guys. I love UNE students. So, and I do hope that everyone will stay engaged. We host a lot of these kinds of events. Be staying tuned for the next presidential forum, which we'll be announcing. But also, if you go to une.edu/news, then you'll see a calendar of all kinds of events going on, films and various discussion groups. We have a Center for Global Humanities where we bring in scholars from across the world who talk about fascinating topics. And so please join us. We really love to engage, not just with our students, faculty, and professional staff, but with our community as well. So thank you all very much, and have a great evening.